The limo arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. Margaret Calloway noticed it first through the kitchen window, the way she noticed most things that happened on Clover Street from a distance, with a cup of coffee warming both her hands and the quiet, particular attention of a woman who had spent 40 years watching young people and learning to see what most others missed. It was a black car, long and immaculate, the kind that existed in this neighborhood only in movies or funerals, and it moved down the street with a slowness that felt deliberate, as though whoever was inside already knew exactly where they were going but wanted a moment longer before they arrived. Margaret set her coffee cup on the counter. She had lived on Clover Street for 31 years. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every house whose gutters needed attention, every dog that barked at the mail carrier and every one that didn't. She knew which families had been here from the beginning and which ones had arrived more recently and which houses now stood empty with their windows beginning to lose their light. Hargrove, Ohio had that particular quality of towns that had once believed in themselves very deeply and then had that belief quietly, systematically taken apart by forces too large and too indifferent to argue with. The mill had closed. Then the processing plant. Then the department store on Main Street whose sign Margaret still occasionally glanced at out of old habit, even though the letters had been gone for 11 years. Then the younger people had begun leaving, the way younger people do when a town stops being able to offer them something worth staying for. Margaret had stayed. She had always stayed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 68 years old, retired now for 3 years after 4 decades of teaching English and literature at Hargrove High School. She was a small woman, slender in the way that comes not from vanity but from years of moving quickly through crowded hallways, always somewhere to be, always someone who needed something. Her hair had gone fully silver in her mid-50s and she had never once considered changing it, because it seemed to her that a woman who had spent 40 years being honest with young people about difficult things had no business being dishonest about her own age. She wore it pulled back simply, a habit from years of leaning over desks and not wanting it falling forward. Her eyes were the light brown of creek water in summer, and they had the quality shared by all great teachers, the quality of appearing, when they looked at you, to be seeing not only what was there but what could be. The house she stood in was modest in every way a house can be modest without quite becoming small. A white craftsman bungalow with a covered porch that she swept every morning whether it needed it or not, window boxes she planted in May and cleared in November, and a side garden that had been, in the years when her husband Daniel was alive, something genuinely beautiful. Daniel had known what he was doing with soil and growing things the way some people simply know, the knowledge sitting somewhere bone deep and intuitive. He had been gone for 7 years now, and the garden had not recovered from losing him, and neither entirely had she, though she had learned in those 7 years to carry the grief the way you carry something heavy for a long time, folded into the ordinary rhythm of days until it becomes simply part of the weight of being. The morning outside the kitchen window was cold and bright, the October light the particular sharp gold that Midwestern autumns produce in those brief days before everything fully lets go. The maples along Clover Street were at their peak, burning orange and amber, and the air when Margaret had stepped outside to check the mail an hour earlier had smelled of wood smoke and dry leaves and something faintly sweet she had never been able to identify and had spent 30 years trying to. She was due at the pharmacy on Birch Street at 10 o'clock. She had been managing this appointment in her mind since yesterday, calculating and recalculating the small arithmetic of her week the way she had calculated it for 3 years now. Since the school district's pension restructuring had reduced her monthly income by $412 without ceremony or apology, a single letter arriving on a January afternoon to inform her that due to actuarial adjustments and funding allocation changes, her benefit amount would reflect the revised scale effective the first of the following month. She had read that letter standing at this kitchen counter, in the same morning light, and she had read it again, because the first time she had been certain she had misunderstood something. She had not misunderstood anything. $412 per month. For the rest of her life. She had sat down at the kitchen table and thought about Daniel, who had died believing the pension was secure, who had sat across from her at this same table and told her they were going to be all right, that 40 years of service amounted to something, that the district honored its people. She had thought about the 32 years she had spent at Hargrove High School before Daniel passed, and the 8 years after, because she had not known how to stop, because the classroom was the one place that had always made complete sense to her, the one room in the world where her particular way of seeing people was not excessive but necessary. She had sat at the table for 20 minutes. Then she had gotten up, because there was no productive arrangement of 20 minutes of sitting at a kitchen table that resolved a $412 monthly reduction, and because her mother, Evelyn Calloway, had raised 3 children in rural Kentucky on a schoolteacher's salary and 2 part-time jobs and had instilled in all 3 of them an absolute intolerance for self-pity that Margaret had never fully managed to argue her way out of, even when she felt it was warranted. She managed. That was the word for it, the word she used when her daughter Patricia called on Sunday evenings from Portland and asked how things were going. She managed. Patricia, who was 41 and worked in hospital administration and had her father's precise, organized mind, had offered twice to send money. Margaret had declined both times with a firmness that left no room for negotiation, because accepting money from your child, in Margaret Calloway's understanding of the world, was a door you only walked through when the alternative was worse, and she had not yet reached that threshold. She was close to it, though. That was the truth she carried through the bright October mornings and the pharmacy arithmetic and the careful weekly grocery lists where she made decisions about which necessities could be postponed. The medical bills from her hip surgery 18 months ago had been larger than her savings could absorb. She had paid what she could and arranged a payment plan for the rest, and that payment came out of the same monthly budget that was already $412 smaller than it had been, and the mathematics of it had a kind of relentless, grinding quality that she did her best not to think about in the early hours of the morning when the house was quiet and the thinking was hardest to control. The letter from the county assessor's office had arrived 3 weeks ago. It informed her, in the same bureaucratic plainness as the pension letter, that her property tax bill for the year was overdue and that a lien could be initiated on the property if full payment was not received within 60 days. The amount was $2,340. She had read that number and put the letter in the kitchen drawer and closed the drawer and made herself a second cup of coffee, because some information requires a small ritual before you can look at it clearly. She had not yet told Patricia. She would figure it out. She had always figured things out. That was what she told herself on the mornings when figuring things out felt like climbing a staircase that kept adding steps. And now there was a black limousine on Clover Street. It had slowed almost to a stop in front of the Hendersons' old house, 3 doors down, and for a moment Margaret thought that was where it was going, that someone had bought the Henderson property finally and was arriving to look at it, and she almost turned back to her coffee. But the car didn't stop at the Henderson house. It kept moving, slowly, with that deliberate unhurried quality, and it stopped in front of hers. Margaret stood at the kitchen window and looked at it. She was not a woman who read drama into ordinary events. 40 years in classrooms had thoroughly calibrated her sense of what was actually significant and what only appeared to be. She had seen genuine crisis, the kind that arrived quietly in a student's eyes before it ever arrived in their words, and she had seen theater, the kind that teenagers constructed with great skill to avoid the quieter, more difficult conversations. She knew the difference. This felt significant. The driver's door opened. A man in a dark uniform stepped out and walked around the car to the rear door. He opened it with a professionalism that seemed, on Clover Street, extraordinary and slightly surreal, like watching a scene from a different world being staged in the middle of her own. The person who stepped out of the car was a man. Margaret could see that much from the window. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark overcoat. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment after the car door closed behind him, and he looked at her house. Just looked at it. The way you look at something you have been trying to remember for a very long time and are now checking against what memory gave you. Margaret set down her coffee cup, wiped her hands on her cardigan, and went to answer the door. She had not yet opened it when the knock came. 3 knocks, unhurried, with a particular spacing between them that she associated, for reasons she couldn't immediately explain, with patience. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was somewhere in his early 50s, brown-skinned, with the kind of face that has settled fully into itself, a face that knows what it has been through and has made its peace with the knowledge. His dark hair was cropped close, touched with silver at the temples. He was not what she would have called handsome in the conventional way, but he had a quality of presence that was more compelling than handsomeness, a quality of absolute self-possession that made you aware, immediately, that this was a person who had arrived somewhere. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was composed and still on the surface, the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times and trusted his own preparation. But underneath it, in the very specific place that teachers learn to read because students are never as hidden as they believe, there was something that was neither composed nor still. There was the thing that comes when you find what you have been looking for after a very long search. He said her name. Not Miss Calloway. Not Margaret. He said it the way he would have said it 35 years ago, sitting in the third row of room 114, the way he would have raised his hand to answer a question when everyone else in the room had already given up. He said, Mrs. C., and the world behind Margaret Calloway's eyes rearranged itself entirely. She had a system for her memories of former students, a system built across decades out of necessity, because 40 years of teaching produces somewhere in the range of 1,000 young people who pass through your life and leave traces of varying depth and permanence. Most she remembered with general warmth and partial clarity, a name attached to a face, a specific moment attached to a name. Some she remembered fully, the ones who had needed something particular from her that she had been able to give, the ones whose stories had intersected with her own in ways that left permanent impressions. And then there were the handful, the very small handful, whose faces she still saw with perfect clarity when she closed her eyes, whose voices she could still hear with complete precision, whose stories she had carried for years the way you carry the ones that changed something fundamental about how you understand what teaching is for. Elias Reyes was at the top of that list. He had been at the top of that list since the morning in April of 1991 when she had stood in Principal Hartwell's office and refused to leave until she got what she came for. She looked at the man on her porch and she saw, underneath the overcoat and the silver at his temples and the particular quality of presence that comes from a life fully lived, the 17-year-old boy who used to arrive at room 114 12 minutes before the first bell, not because he was required to but because he needed the quiet before the room filled, because the noise of the hallways in those years was sometimes too large for him to carry. She opened the door wider, and she said the only thing that felt adequate to the moment, which was nothing at all. She simply stood aside to let him in. He stepped into her living room and looked around at it the way he had looked at the house from the street, with the particular concentrated attention of a person comparing memory against reality. She watched him look at the bookshelves that covered most of the east wall, at the reading chair by the window that had been Daniel's and was now hers, at the small framed photographs arranged on the side table. He stopped when he reached the photograph of the Hargrove High School English department from 1994, a group of 7 teachers arranged in front of the school's main entrance, squinting slightly against the afternoon sun. Margaret was in the center. She was 34 in that photograph, and she looked exactly like what she was, a person in the middle of work that mattered to her. Elias looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned back to her. His jaw moved slightly before the words came. She recognized that. She had watched him do the same thing in her classroom when the answer to a question was forming itself somewhere behind his eyes and he was waiting for the exact right shape of it before he spoke. "I've been looking for you," he said. "For a while." Margaret sat down in the chair nearest the door, not Daniel's chair, the one across from it, the one she had always occupied in the evenings when they read together. She gestured to the sofa, and Elias sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in a posture so identical to the one he had carried as a 17-year-old that something in her chest contracted briefly and painfully with the weight of how much time had passed. "You should have called the school," she said. "They keep alumni records." "I did," he said. "It took 2 years and 4 different administrators before someone found your home address." He paused. "I don't think they were being deliberately difficult. I think they just weren't sure who I was or why I was asking." Margaret looked at him steadily. "And who are you?" she said. Not meaning it the way it might have sounded from someone else. Meaning it in the way she had always asked her students questions, as an invitation rather than a challenge. He answered her the way he had always answered her questions, directly, without embellishment, with the particular economy of language that she had recognized in him from the very beginning as one of his most distinctive qualities. "My company is called Reyes Technology Solutions," he said. "We build infrastructure software for hospitals and regional medical systems. We're in 31 countries." A brief pause. "We went public 4 years ago." She looked at him for a moment. "I read about that," she said quietly. "In the Plain Dealer. I cut the article out." She stopped. "I'm not sure I believed it was the same person." Something moved across his face. "It's the same person," he said. Margaret had known Elias Reyes for exactly 1 year. He had walked into her classroom in September of 1990, a junior at Hargrove High, assigned to her third-period AP English Literature class by a schedule she had not been consulted on and a guidance system that at the time processed students through available slots rather than actual suitability. He had arrived on the first day carrying a paperback copy of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison that was so well read the spine had been taped together twice, and he had sat in the third row and said nothing for the first 3 weeks except to answer direct questions, and his answers, every time, had been so precise and so genuinely considered that the other students had started watching him the way they watched something they didn't entirely understand. She had understood him immediately, or had begun to, which amounted in practice to the same thing. She understood the particular quality of silence that belongs to students who have learned that speaking costs something, that the wrong classroom is a place where the sharpest observations draw the most unwanted attention, and who have become expert at appearing to be less present than they are. She had seen students like Elias before. She had been making room for them her entire career, making the classroom a space where the quality of the thinking was the only currency that mattered, where the brand of shoes and the neighborhood of the house and the length of the waiting list for the school lunch program were not relevant data. Hargrove High School in 1990 was not an easy place to run that kind of classroom. The building was old, the resources were tight, the staff was a mixture of people who were there because they loved it and people who were there because they had run out of other options. The student body was 60% white, 30% Latino, 10% Black, in a town where those percentages had historically determined certain outcomes, not officially, not in any document, but in the accumulated weight of low expectations and tracking systems and guidance counselors who filled college prep schedules differently depending on factors that had nothing to do with academic ability. Elias Reyes was the son of Isabel and Rodrigo Reyes. His mother was a certified nursing assistant who worked double shifts at Hargrove Regional Medical Center on weekends and holidays because the weekend differential helped. His father had worked at the processing plant until it began laying off and was now working 2 part-time jobs that together made slightly less than the 1 full-time position had. They lived in a rental house on the east side of Hargrove, in the neighborhood that people on the west side sometimes referred to in ways that revealed more about the speaker than the place. Elias had a younger sister, Valentina, who was 12 and already showing the same quality of intelligence that her brother carried, the kind that needs the right room or it turns inward. He had been assigned to AP English Literature not because anyone had particularly advocated for him, but because the AP slots had not been fully filled by the students the guidance department considered natural candidates, and Elias had scored high enough on his diagnostic assessment that leaving him out would have required a more explicit justification than anyone wanted to provide. Margaret had noticed him on the first day, as she noticed all of them on the first day. She had particularly noticed the Ellison paperback and the way he held it, not to be seen holding it, but because he was actually reading it while the other students found their seats. She had particularly noticed the way his eyes moved when she wrote the first discussion question on the board and the fraction of a second before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. She had noticed, and she had waited, and on the 14th day of school she had put a question to the class that she had constructed specifically for him, though none of them knew that, a question about the difference between invisibility and silence, whether a person could be both at once or whether one always excluded the other. He had answered it. Slowly at first, one sentence, then then a third that built on the previous two in a way that was structurally beautiful, that added a dimension the question itself hadn't contained, and by the time he had finished speaking, the room was quiet in the particular way that happens when something genuinely intelligent has just been said aloud in a space where people can recognize it. Margaret had said, yes. Exactly that. And Elias Reyes had looked at her with an expression that she had filed away in the permanent record she kept, a filing system no administration had ever had access to, as the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time to be told they are correct. After that, he came to class 12 minutes early every day. She had started leaving books on his desk. Not assignments. Extra books. Not requirements, invitations. A copy of Hunger of Memory. A worn collection of Neruda in translation. A slim volume of James Baldwin essays that she had owned since college and had underlined extensively and which she told him, when he tried to return it, to keep. She had said it with the casualness of someone who had not thought about it much, though she had thought about it considerably, because teachers on Hargrove High's salary bought their own supplies and their own supplementary texts and their own extra copies of things they wanted students to have, and it added up. She had not minded. She had never minded that particular expense. The problem with other teachers was not universal. There were good people in that building, people who cared and worked hard and would have done anything within their limited power to serve the students they were responsible for. But there were also, as in every school Margaret had worked in, people who had absorbed the unspoken hierarchies of the institution so thoroughly that they enforced them without noticing, the way you enforce a habit you no longer remember forming. Elias had a homeroom teacher named Mr. Decker who referred to the East Side students collectively as that group and who once, in the faculty lounge in earshot of Margaret, said that some kids were going to end up working with their hands and you weren't doing them any favors by filling their heads with ideas that couldn't take root. He had not said this cruelly. He had said it with the patient authority of a man sharing a piece of accumulated wisdom, and the three colleagues sitting with him had nodded with the comfortable agreement of people who have heard something that confirms what they already believed. Margaret had set down her coffee mug and left the faculty lounge without responding, because she had learned many years earlier that certain arguments were not productive in faculty lounges but became entirely productive in principals' offices, in school board meetings, in the structural decisions that determined whose desk got the extra book and whose didn't. Guidance counselor Eleanor Pierce was more sophisticated in her version of the same limitation. She was a woman who genuinely believed she had no biases, who would have been offended at any suggestion that she did, and who nonetheless had a persistent habit of steering her highest-performing East Side students toward community college preparation rather than four-year university applications, explaining this to the students themselves as practicality and to their parents as a gentle realism about the demands of college financing. She was not inventing the financial challenge. The financial challenge was real. But she was using it as a ceiling where it should have been a starting point for problem solving. Elias had mentioned Mrs. Pierce to Margaret once, in the way students mention things they have mostly accepted as unchangeable, the way they describe a rule that seems arbitrary but has been enforced long enough that questioning it seems beside the point. He had gone to see Mrs. Pierce in October to ask about applying to a four-year university, and she had given him a folder of material about Hargrove Community College that was thorough and well-organized and entirely beside the point of what he had asked. He hadn't said it was unfair. He had said it matter-of-factly, with the same economy of language he applied to everything. Margaret had listened to this without expression and had then asked him, also matter-of-factly, whether he had considered the Regional Academic Merit Scholarship. He had not. He had not, because no one had mentioned it to him, which was itself the information Margaret needed. The Regional Academic Merit Scholarship was a $2,000 award given annually by the Hargrove Millbrook Educational Foundation to a graduating or current high school student demonstrating exceptional academic achievement. $2,000 was not enough to pay for college. It was not intended to be. It was intended as recognition, as a signal from the community that a student's abilities had been seen and valued. But it came with something more practically useful, a letter of distinction from the foundation that could accompany college applications and that carried, in the estimation of certain admissions offices, a weight disproportionate to the dollar amount attached to it. Margaret knew this because she had watched it work before. The application process required a qualifying examination, a teacher letter of recommendation, and a written essay. The committee that selected the recipient was composed of 3 members of the foundation board and the school principal. Elias had taken the qualifying examination in November of that year. He had received the highest score in the district. Not the highest score among East Side students, or the highest score in his grade, but the highest score in the district, across all 3 high schools that fed into the Hargrove-Millbrook system. His essay, which Margaret had read in draft 3 times and suggested edits for twice, was, in her quiet and professionally calibrated opinion, among the best pieces of expository writing she had seen from a student in 20 years of teaching. She had submitted her letter of recommendation with the conviction that the outcome was, at that point, determined. What happened next was the thing Margaret had carried for 35 years. Principal Gerald Hartwell called her into his office on a Thursday morning in late February and told her, with the careful courtesy of a man delivering news he has pre-justified to himself, that the scholarship committee had reached a decision and that the award would be given to a student named Bradley Whitfield, a junior from Hargrove's West Side whose qualifying exam score had ranked 4th overall and whose essay, in Margaret's reading of it as a committee member who had been handed copies, without being invited to the meeting, was competent and entirely unremarkable. Margaret had sat across from Principal Hartwell and held the committee decision in her hands and been, for a moment, very still in the way she was still when she was thinking clearly rather than reacting. Then she had looked up. "Bradley Whitfield's father is on the school board," she said. Hartwell's expression did not change. "The committee's decision is based entirely on the criteria established by the foundation. Elias Reyes scored 23 points higher than Bradley Whitfield on the qualifying examination. The examination is one component of the assessment. His essay was stronger. That is a subjective measure. The letter of distinction carries more weight with admissions offices than the dollar amount," Margaret said. "This scholarship, given to Elias Reyes, is the difference between a 4-year university application that gets read seriously and one that gets read the way a stack of papers gets read when someone is tired and looking for reasons to move to the next pile." Hartwell folded his hands on his desk. "Margaret," he said, using her first name in the manner of administrators who wish to signal that the professional conversation has shifted into something more personal and therefore less actionable, "I understand your investment in this student. That investment speaks well of you. But the committee has made its decision, and it is final." "Nothing is final," Margaret said, "until the award has been given." She had stood up and walked out of his office and gone back to room 114, where her 3rd period class was about to start, and she had taught the class with the full attention she brought to every class, because her students deserved her full attention regardless of what was happening in the principal's office. After school that day, she had called 3 members of the foundation board whose contact information she had obtained from the district's public directory, because the directory was public and the information was available and she was not doing anything that required more than a willingness to use it. 2 of the 3 had not returned her calls. The third, a woman named Dorothy Ames who had retired from teaching the year before Margaret started and whom Margaret knew slightly through a mutual colleague, had returned the call the following morning and had listened to Margaret describe the examination scores and the essay quality with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 30 years in classrooms and understood exactly what she was being told. Dorothy had said, "I'll make some calls." What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic in any of the ways drama usually announces itself. It was quiet and persistent, and it involved a number of conversations in rooms Margaret was not present in, negotiations between the foundation board and the school committee that produced, in the end, a decision that Principal Hartwell delivered to Margaret in a second meeting with the compressed brevity of a man who has lost an argument he did not expect to lose. The scholarship, he told her, would be awarded to both students. The foundation had agreed to provide 2 awards this year, given, as he phrased it, the exceptional quality of the candidate pool. Margaret had known this was not a genuine assessment of the candidate pool. She had known this was a compromise that had been reached because the alternative had become politically uncomfortable. She had also known that the practical outcome for Elias was identical regardless of the politics involved. She had asked for a meeting with Elias the following afternoon. She had asked him to come to room 114 after the final bell. He had arrived at the door with the wariness that characterized him in any situation that departed from established routine, a wariness she had learned to read not as distrust but as intelligence, the reasonable caution of a person who had learned that departures from routine frequently contained unwanted surprises. She had told him about the scholarship. She had told him the full number, the letter of distinction, and what it could mean for his applications. She had watched his face as he received this information, and she had watched the particular sequence of expressions that moved through it, the disbelief that something good had actually happened, the cautious recalibration, the attempt to hold the news at a slight distance until it could be confirmed as real. She had slid the formal notification letter across her desk to him. He had picked it up and read it. He had read it again. He had looked up at her and said, "How?" Margaret had said, "You earned it." The rest was just making sure the right people understood that. His eyes had done the thing that eyes do when a person is preventing themselves from crying in a room where they have decided not to cry, the stillness, the absolute controlled stillness of the muscles around them. He had looked down at the letter. "Mrs. C," he said quietly, not looking up. "Yes. I'm going to pay this back someday." He had said it without melodrama, without the grand flourish of a person making a promise for an audience. He had said it the way he said everything, plainly and with complete intent. She had looked at him with the full attention she had given him since the first day he sat in the third row of her classroom with his battered paperback and his careful silence. "You earned this," she had said. "That's all that matters." He had graduated the following June. He had been accepted to 3 universities and had chosen Ohio State on a combination of the scholarship, a need-based financial aid package that Margaret had helped his mother Isabel navigate through 3 separate applications, and a part-time work arrangement with the university's IT department that he had secured himself, through a combination of initiative and a technical aptitude that no one at Hargrove High had ever formally assessed because no one had thought to. Margaret had attended the graduation ceremony and watched him walk across the stage. Isabel Reyes had been 3 rows ahead of her in the bleachers, wearing a dress the color of the sky on a day with no clouds, and when Elias's name was called, she had put her hands over her mouth and pressed them there, hard, for several seconds, and Margaret had looked away to give her the privacy of that moment. She had received 1 letter from Elias in his first semester at Ohio State. It was handwritten on notepaper, 3 pages, and it described his first weeks at university with the same precision and economy he had always applied to language, the things that surprised him, the things that confirmed what he had expected, a professor whose teaching style reminded him of hers. He had signed it, gratefully, Elias. She had put it in the drawer of her desk, the small desk in the corner of the bedroom that held the things she considered important. After that, she had not heard from him for 35 years. Not because she expected to. Not because she had done any of it expecting something in return. She had done it because it was correct. Because every student who earned something deserved to receive it. Because the alternative, the version of that year in which she had accepted Gerald Hartwell's first answer and Elias Reyes had received a folder of community college brochures from Mrs. Pierce and the scholarship had gone to the 4th-ranked examiner, was a version she could not have lived inside. She had thought about him occasionally over the years, the way you think about the students who stay with you, with a mild and affectionate curiosity about where they had gone. She had sometimes told his story, a version of it, to younger colleagues who were struggling with the specific kind of institutional obstacle he had faced, because the story had a lesson in it that she felt was worth passing forward. She had never told it as a story about herself. It was his story. She had only been a part of it. She had not told it to anyone in a long time. The younger colleagues had become fewer as she got older, and the conversations of the faculty lounge had changed, and she had retired 3 years ago into the quiet of Clover Street and the payment plan and the property tax letter in the kitchen drawer, and she had carried on the way she had always carried on, with the quiet stubborn dignity her mother had given her, attending to the things that were in her power and trying not to spend too much time in the early morning hours thinking about the things that were not. And now Elias Reyes was sitting on her living room sofa. He had not spoken since she had let him in and gestured toward the sofa, and she had not pressed him, because she had learned a very long time ago that some people needed the room to be still before they could put the right words into it. Outside, the October light was doing something extraordinary through the maples, the particular layering of gold on gold that happened only for a few days each fall, and Margaret could see it through the living room window behind Elias, framing him in that warmth, and she thought that the world had a habit, sometimes, of arranging itself with a precision that felt deliberate. He reached inside his coat and set something on the coffee table between them. It was a photograph, old, faded at the edges, printed on the slightly glossy paper of photographs from a certain era. Margaret looked at it without picking it up. It was room 114. The desks were empty, the end of a school day or the beginning of one, the chalkboard still holding the remnants of whatever had been written on it that period, and standing at the front of the room near her desk was a person Margaret recognized as herself at 34. In the blue cardigan she had worn most of that year because the room ran cold in the mornings, looking down at something on her desk with the particular focused expression of someone reading student work. She looked at him. "Where did you get this?" "I took it," he said. "The last week of school." "You were reading and I had my mother's camera in my bag because we were doing a project for another class." He looked at the photograph. "I've kept it for 35 years. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. "Elias," she said. "Yes." "Why did you come?" He looked at her with the expression she had seen on his face in room 114 when he was building toward an answer, when the thought was fully formed and he was giving it the right shape before he trusted it to language. "Because 35 years ago," he said quietly, "someone told me I had earned something. And I have been thinking about what that means, and what I owe because of it, for a very long time." The October light moved through the maples and fell through the window across the coffee table and the old photograph, and outside on Clover Street the limousine sat at the curb with the engine off, and Margaret Calloway looked at the man across from her and understood, with the particular understanding that comes only at the intersection of great time and great consequence, that the story she had begun telling in room 114 in September of 1990 had not, in fact, ended. It had simply been waiting for this room, this morning, this light. She made coffee. It was the thing she knew how to do in moments that required something to do with the hands, and it was also the practical and correct thing because the morning was cold and Elias had come from somewhere, and people who came from somewhere in October in Ohio needed coffee. She moved through the small ritual of it in the kitchen while he sat in the living room, and she was aware of him the way you are aware of something large and significant that has entered a familiar space and changed the dimensions of it slightly, not unpleasantly, but undeniably. She brought 2 cups to the living room and set his on the coffee table beside the photograph and sat down across from him in her chair. He thanked her. He held the mug the way she had seen students hold things they were grateful for, with both hands, as if the warmth of it were itself a kind of gift. She waited. She had never needed to fill silence with a student. It was one of the qualities she had worked hardest to develop in her early years of teaching, before she had understood that silence in a classroom was not dead space but living space, that the right kind of quiet was where thinking happened, where the real answers formed themselves. She had extended that understanding into every significant conversation she had ever had, and she extended it now. Elias looked at the mug for a moment. Then he began. He had not come to Hargrove prepared with a speech. She understood this about him immediately, because the speech would have been unlike him, too constructed, too much architecture in front of the actual thing. What he had instead was the accumulation of 35 years of living and the particular vocabulary that accumulation produces, the language of someone who has traveled a very long way and is still deciding how much of the journey to describe. He started with Ohio State. He had arrived in Columbus in September of 1991 with a single duffel bag, $240, and a conviction about himself that he described to Margaret, in the living room on Clover Street 35 years later, as the only kind of conviction that actually works, the kind that is not based on evidence but simply exists as a structural fact inside you, something you could not argue yourself out of even if you tried. He had tried, more than once. Ohio State had been large in a way he had not anticipated, not large in the sense of physically overwhelming, though it was that too, but large in the sense of containing so many versions of a possible life that the space between who you were and who you might become felt both enormous and navigable simultaneously. He had found the computer lab in the first week and had spent most of his first semester in it after his other obligations were met, not because he was behind academically but because the machines made a kind of sense to him that almost nothing else in his life had ever made with such clarity and immediacy. He had taken his first computer science class that fall. The professor, a small, dry-humored man named Dr. Petrakis, had assigned a problem set in the second week that was meant to take 4 to 6 hours. Elias had finished it in 90 minutes and then gone back through it and solved it 3 additional ways and left all 4 solutions in the submission with a note explaining the structural differences between them. Dr. Petrakis had called him to his office. Elias had gone expecting to be told he had misunderstood the assignment. He had been told instead that he had the particular kind of mind that either becomes very important or wastes itself, and that Dr. Petrakis personally intended to ensure it was the former, and that Elias should come to the advanced seminar on Thursday evenings if he wanted to understand what computing was actually going to become. He had gone to the seminar. He had gone every Thursday for 3 years. He had also worked. He had the IT department job he had arranged before arriving, and he had added 2 more in his second year when the balance of tuition, living costs, and his family's situation at home required it. He sent $120 to Hargrove every month, to his mother Isabel, which was not much but was the amount he could send without compromising his own ability to stay enrolled, and he did the calculation every month with the same precision he applied to the problem sets in Dr. Petrakis's seminar, because the variables were equally important and the stakes were considerably higher. He had thought about Margaret during those years more than he would have been able to explain. Not in the way you think about a person you miss, though there was some of that, but in the way you think about a structural element of yourself, a thing that became part of how you're built. The year in room 114 had done something to the architecture of how he understood what he was capable of. It had not given him the capability. He had always had the capability. What it had given him was the evidence that someone outside of himself could see it, and that evidence, in the particular ecology of his early life, had been the difference between believing in himself as a kind of faith and believing in himself as a demonstrated fact. There is a version of him, he told Margaret, in which none of that year happened. In which he sits in third-period English literature and is not handed extra books and is not asked the question about invisibility and silence and does not discover that the thing he has been doing with language in private is something a teacher of significant expertise considers worth encouraging. In which the scholarship goes to the 4th-ranked examiner and the letter of distinction goes with it and the college applications go out without that weight behind them. He had thought about that version of himself with some regularity. He had thought about him as a warning and a debt simultaneously. Margaret listened to all of this with the cup warm in her hands and her eyes on his face, and she did not say anything that would interrupt the shape of it, because the shape was important, the specific sequence of it, and interrupting would have been like arriving too early to something that was not yet ready. He described the company, but not in the way that people describe companies when they want to impress. He described it the way you describe something you built by solving a problem that genuinely mattered to you. His mother had spent most of her working life inside hospitals, and he had grown up understanding the specific texture of how those institutions operated from the inside, the complexity and the inefficiency and the places where the systems failed the people who needed them. He had seen it continue at Ohio State in the University Medical Center where a friend of his worked and described the same frustrations in the same language. He had built his first real software project in his senior year, a data management system for a single department in that medical center, as a favor, unpaid, because the problem interested him and solving it correctly felt like something he owed. The department head had asked him, when it was finished, how much he wanted for it. He had said he did not want anything, that it was a project. The department head had looked at him for a long moment and had then said, "You understand you have just built something that 3 different vendors have been trying to sell us for 4 years and failing, and that this works and those didn't." He had said yes, he was aware of that, that was why the problem had interested him. He had left Ohio State in the spring of 1995. He had worked for 2 years at a software firm in Columbus, learning everything the firm could teach him and several things it couldn't, and then he had taken the $12,000 he had saved, and a second-hand server rack, and a small, cold office space in a Columbus business incubator, and he had built the first version of what would become Reyes Technology Solutions. The first 3 years had been the kind of years you cannot accurately describe to people who have not lived a version of them. He had been broke in the specific way that is not about hardship but about the complete willingness to accept hardship in exchange for something you believe in completely. He had gone months without a salary. He had called his mother from that cold office and told her things were going well when they were not going well, because she had enough to worry about and he was not going to add himself to the list. He had eaten from vending machines more evenings than he could count and had worked until 2 and 3 in the morning because the work required it and because the particular quality of silence in that building at those hours was the only kind of quiet in which he could think clearly enough to solve the problems he was trying to solve. The first hospital system contract had come in the fall of 1998. It was a regional network in central Ohio, for facilities, a modest contract by any eventual standard but enormous in the context of what he had at the time. He had delivered on it completely and on time, and 3 months after implementation, the chief information officer of that network had called him and asked if he had thought about expanding. He had thought about nothing else. Margaret looked at him across the coffee table and the old photograph and the October morning, and she thought about Isabel Reyes in a dress the color of the sky on graduation day, hands pressed over her mouth. "Does your mother know you're here?" she asked. Something happened in his face. A warmth that was also something more complicated. "She's been trying to come with me," he said, "since I told her 3 months ago that I'd finally found you." He paused. "I told her I needed to come alone first." "Why?" He thought about this with the same consideration he gave everything. "Because what I need to say to you is mine to say. Not ours." He looked at his coffee. "She'll have her own conversation with you. She's already written a letter. She's been revising it for 6 weeks." Margaret felt something move through her chest that was warm and sharp simultaneously, the specific feeling of being more loved than you have allowed yourself to expect. "She doesn't need to write me a letter," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why she's been revising it." She almost smiled. Then she looked at the photograph on the coffee table, at the woman she had been in that classroom, and she thought about the 35 years between that woman and this chair, and she felt the particular weight of time that only arrives in moments when time makes itself suddenly visible. She did not know yet what he intended. She had not asked. It was not in her nature to run ahead of a conversation that had its own pace and needed to be allowed to keep it. She had learned this in classrooms over decades, that the most important thing a teacher can do is stay in the moment she is actually in rather than the one she is anticipating, because the anticipated moment is almost never the real one. "Tell me about the company," she said. "The real version. Not the newspaper version." He looked at her. "You read the newspaper version." "I taught literature for 40 years, she said. "I know the difference between the story and the thing the story is about." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his coffee down and leaned forward and told her. The company was, at its core, a piece of infrastructure that most people never thought about the way most people never thought about the pipes in their walls or the wiring in their ceilings, until those things failed, at which point they thought about very little else. Reyes Technology Solutions built the systems that connected hospital networks, that managed patient data across facilities, that allowed the information a doctor needed to be available at the moment the doctor needed it rather than 3 hours later. He had watched his mother work in environments where the failure of those systems had direct consequences for patients and for the people caring for them, and he had spent 20 years building something that made those failures rarer. It was in 31 countries now. There were 4,060 people who worked for the company in some capacity. He said this number with a particular quality of weight, not pride, or not only pride, but the weight of something that is larger than the person who built it, something that has become real enough to have its own momentum. He had taken it public 4 years ago because the scale of what he needed to build next required capital that private investment could not adequately provide. The IPO had been, by any measure, remarkable. The Plain Dealer article Margaret had cut out had described it as one of the most significant Ohio technology company launches in a decade. She had cut it out because she had seen the name and stood at the kitchen counter on a Wednesday morning 3 years ago and thought of the boy in the third row with the taped-together paperback, and she had not been entirely certain it was the same person, but she had cut it out anyway and put it in the same drawer as his letter from 1991. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He was watching her now with an expression she could not fully read, which was unusual. She had always been able to read him. It occurred to her that 35 years was a long time and that the person across from her, though he was in some essential way the same person who had sat in the third row of her classroom, was also someone she had never met, someone formed in full by the decades between then and now, and that the unfamiliar expression was simply the expression of a person she did not yet completely know. Then she understood what she was seeing. He was reading her the way she had always read him. He was doing what she had spent 40 years doing in classrooms, looking at the surface of the room and finding the thing underneath it that the surface was covering. He was sitting in her living room and seeing the things she had arranged in her mind to be ordinary and unremarkable, and he was finding the things that were neither. He was looking at the garden through the side window, the garden that had been beautiful when Daniel was alive and had not recovered. Not because of grief alone, but because recovering a garden required money for new plantings and time for the physical work of it, and Margaret's hip, since the surgery, was not reliably capable of the kneeling and the lifting that a garden that size demanded. He was looking at the bookshelf, which was full, because books were the one expense she had never been able to bring herself to cut, but which had a particular quality of being the same books it had held for several years, no new additions in the specific spots where new additions would have appeared if things had been otherwise. He was looking at the cardigan she was wearing, which was good quality, the kind of thing that lasts, which was why she had it, but which was also several years old in the way that good things worn carefully show their age honestly. He was, she understood, reading the room. She felt a flicker of something that was almost protective pride, the instinct to straighten something, to indicate that things were fine, that she was managing. But she sat with the instinct and let it pass, because she had spent 40 years teaching young people that the most important form of courage was the courage to be seen accurately, and she was not going to contradict that lesson in her own living room. "The pharmacy," she said, not knowing quite why she said it. He looked at her. "What about the pharmacy?" "I had an appointment there this morning. For 10 o'clock. She checked the small clock on the side table. It was 9:47. "I'm going to miss it." "What do you need from the pharmacy?" She considered this for a fraction of a second, the trained reflex to say nothing important, something minor, "I'll go this afternoon." And then she considered the person across from her, who had driven or flown to Hargrove, Ohio, in October and sat in a room with her and described 35 years of his life with complete honesty, and she let the reflex go. "One of my prescriptions is due," she said. "I've been timing when I pick it up because the insurance doesn't cover it fully until a certain date in the cycle, and the out-of-pocket is significant if I pick it up too early." She said this plainly, the way she said most things, without drama but without apology. "I've been managing the timing of it." He was very still. "How long have you been doing that?" "A while." "How long is a while, Mrs. C?" She looked at him. She had not been called that in 3 years. 14 months, she said. He did not react the way people sometimes reacted to this kind of information, with the visible discomfort of someone who doesn't know what to do with it and wants to move past it. He stayed exactly where he was and absorbed it the way he had always absorbed difficult information, completely, without flinching, as data that needed to be held fully before it could be responded to. "The pension restructuring," he said. It was not a question. He had done his research, she understood. He had not arrived at her door without understanding the shape of things. "Yes," she said. "How much?" she told him. He received the number without changing his expression. She told him about the hip surgery 18 months ago and the bills that the coverage had not fully absorbed and the payment plan that came out of the reduced monthly amount. She told him about the property tax letter in the kitchen drawer. She had not planned to tell him about the property tax letter. But she had started, and there was a quality to his attention, the focused, complete attention he had always brought to things that mattered, that made stopping feel dishonest. He said, "May I see the letter?" She went to the kitchen and opened the drawer and came back with it. She handed it to him and watched him read it. He read it the way he had read his scholarship notification 35 years ago, twice, completely, with his full attention. When he looked up, his expression had the controlled quality of a person managing a response they have decided not to produce in its full form. 60 days from receipt, he said. Yes. When did you receive it? 23 days ago. He set the letter on the coffee table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Do you have a copy of the pension restructuring documentation? The original notification and anything subsequent? In the filing cabinet in the spare room, she said. I keep everything. I know you do, he said quietly. I know you do. She went to get the file. While she was in the spare room pulling the folder from the cabinet, she heard him make a phone call. His voice was low and professional and she caught only fragments of it, a woman's name, Hannah, a request for something to be prepared, a reference to an address. When she came back to the living room, he had put the phone away and was looking at the photograph again. She sat down and handed him the file. He opened it and read through the documentation with the same focused efficiency, the same quality of looking for the exact sentence that changed the shape of everything, that she had been watching him apply to things since he was 17 years old. He made notes in a small notebook he took from his inside coat pocket. His handwriting had the same quality his speaking had, precise, economical, every letter placed with intent. After 12 minutes, he set the file down. The restructuring notification does not include an appeals process disclosure, he said. District pension modifications of this size are required by Ohio statute to include a documented appeals window and a formal grievance procedure. If those disclosures were absent from the original communication, the modification itself may be legally challengeable. She looked at him. I'm not a lawyer. No, he said. But I have several. He paused. One of them is going to call you tomorrow, with your permission, to review this documentation. She was quiet for a moment. The old instinct moved through her, the one that said you manage what's yours, you don't accept things you haven't earned, that taking help too readily was a way of losing something essential about yourself. She sat with it and recognized it for what it was, not dignity but its imitation, the performance of self-sufficiency that sometimes costs more than it protects. All right, she said. He nodded and made a note. Outside, the October light had shifted. It was past 10 o'clock now, the pharmacy appointment behind her, the morning moving forward. Margaret became aware that she was hungry and that she had not thought about food because the morning had not left room for it. She stood up. Have you eaten? She asked. He looked almost startled by the simplicity of the question. Not since early this morning. She went to the kitchen. He appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, the way students had appeared in the doorway of room 114, with the particular uncertainty of someone who is not sure if they are welcome but wants to be nearby. She looked at him over her shoulder and gestured to the chair at the kitchen table, Daniel's chair, which she had not consciously designated as such but which she had offered to no one in 7 years and was offering now without hesitation. He sat. She made toast and eggs, which was what she had and what she knew how to make well, the way you know things you have made 10,000 times, without thinking about the mechanics of them. She put the plate in front of him and sat across from him at the table where she had done most of the important thinking of her life and where this morning was now taking its place among the significant mornings. He ate, and they talked, and the conversation that followed was the kind of conversation that could only happen between two people who have known each other in an earlier version and are now meeting in the present, with all the strangeness and the recognition of that particular encounter. He asked about Daniel. She told him, briefly but fully, because the question deserved a real answer and because Elias had always been someone who asked real questions rather than polite ones. She told him about the 7 years since and about how she had learned to organize the grief into the structure of her days rather than letting it organize her, and about how the garden was the thing she missed most on his behalf, not the garden she had failed to maintain but the garden he would have been maintaining, the one that lived in her mind as what it had been. He told her about his own life. He had been married for 14 years to a woman named Priya who was a pediatric surgeon in Columbus and who he described, with the ease of someone who has found an accurate sentence and settled into it, as the only person he had ever met who was more stubborn than he was, which he intended as a high compliment. They had 2 children, a daughter named Clara who was 12 and had, by all accounts, inherited her father's relationship with computers and her mother's relationship with argument, and a son named Daniel, who was 9. He said the name without pausing. Just said it. Daniel. She heard it and felt something open briefly in her chest and close again, warm. It was intentional, he said quietly. The name. She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily. He would have liked that, she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. He nodded once and picked up his toast. She had thought, when she first understood who was standing on her porch, that the conversation would be about the past. That it would be a reunion in the way reunions usually are, a meeting of 2 versions of a story in its original setting, the revisiting of something complete. She had not expected it to feel so much like a beginning. She had also not expected what happened next. Her daughter Patricia called at 11:15. Margaret's phone lit up on the kitchen table and she silenced it after 2 rings, which was a thing she had never done to Patricia's calls before, and Elias noticed, and she saw that he noticed. You should answer, he said. She'll leave a message. Mrs. C. She picked up the phone. Patricia's voice had the particular brisk warmth of a person who had inherited both her mother's directness and her father's organizational precision and had grown up in a household where both were valued. She was calling to confirm Sunday dinner over video call, and she was calling with the quality of someone who had been meaning to call for several days and was slightly guilty about the delay. Mom, you sound different, Patricia said. Are you all right? I'm fine, Margaret said. I have company. A pause. In 7 years of widowhood and 3 years of retirement on Clover Street, Margaret Calloway had not once described her morning as including company. What kind of company? A former student. Another pause. Which student? Margaret looked across the table at the man who had arrived in a limousine and was sitting in Daniel's chair eating her toast and had named his son after her husband. One of the important ones, she said. She could hear Patricia recalibrating. I'll call back later, she said carefully. Sunday is fine, Margaret told her. I'll explain everything Sunday. She put the phone down. Elias was looking at her with an expression she now recognized from earlier, the reading the room expression, but there was something added to it now. Something she could not quite place. He looked like a man who has been building toward something and has arrived at the point where the building is almost done. He said, Can I ask you something? You always could. He looked at his hands around the coffee mug and then looked up. Did you know, when you were fighting for that scholarship, that I would do anything with it? She considered this carefully. The honest answer required some precision. I knew you would do something, she said. The specific something was yours to determine. That's always been true about you. You had the architecture. What you built with it was your decision. He held her gaze. But you believed in it. Yes. Without evidence. With evidence, she said. I had seen you work for 7 months by the time I walked into Hartwell's office. I had watched you read and I had watched you write and I had watched you answer questions that no one else in the room had been willing to answer. That is not an absence of evidence. That's the best kind of evidence there is. He was quiet. She let the quiet sit. Hartwell gave a speech last spring, he said after a moment. At the Hargrove School District Alumni Recognition Dinner. I read about it in the online archive. He talked about his 40 years of service and his legacy of student development. She looked at him steadily. He mentioned 9 students by name, he said. Former students whose accomplishments he cited as part of his legacy. A pause. I was not among them. She had known this without knowing the specific event. She had understood for 35 years that the official record of Gerald Hartwell's principalship and the actual record of what had happened in his school were 2 different documents, and that the official one would always be the one that appeared in alumni dinners and newspaper profiles and eventual obituaries. He retired comfortably? She asked. Full pension, Elias said. The kind that didn't get restructured. He said this without heat, just flatly, as a fact being placed in its proper position next to the adjacent facts. She absorbed this and set it down and did not say anything about it, because saying something about it would have required a tone she had made a decision, many years ago, not to sustain. He watched her absorb and set down and decide. And then something happened in his expression that was the completion of the thing she had been watching build since he walked through her door. The composed surface was still there. Beneath it was something that was not composed at all, something that had been present, she now understood, since he stepped out of the limousine and looked at the house with the checking quality of a man comparing memory against reality. He had come here carrying something. Not just gratitude, not just the weight of 35 years, but something specific and deliberate and fully formed. She could see now that the morning had been a kind of confirmation for him, that he had come with a purpose already intact and had spent these hours in her kitchen and living room not building toward it but verifying that what he already knew was what he needed to know. She waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced an envelope. It was a plain envelope, cream-colored, with her name written on the front in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. The same precision, the same economy, every letter placed with intent. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She did not pick it up. What is this? She said. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, in the room where the important things of her life had been figured out, and he said something that she would think about for the rest of her life in the way you think about the sentences that become permanent. He said, "It's the part you haven't earned yet." She looked at him. He said, "Everything I described to you this morning, the company, the contracts, the 4,000 people, the 31 countries, all of it started in a moment in a classroom in 1991 when a teacher put a question on the board that she wrote specifically for me and then waited while I figured out how to answer it." His voice was even and quiet and completely controlled in the way it was controlled only when he was absolutely certain of what he was saying. It started when someone fought for me to receive something I had earned and refused to accept the answer that would have let her off the hook. He paused. I have spent 35 years thinking about what that means and what I owe because of it, and the answer I have arrived at is not a number. Numbers are easy. Numbers are the smallest part of it. She looked at the envelope on the table. She did not move. Inside that envelope, he said, is a letter. Not from me, though I wrote most of it. From the Reyes Foundation, which we established 6 years ago to fund educational access initiatives. There is also a formal proposal, which my team and I have been developing for 3 months, for an endowed chair in English literature and writing at Hargrove High School. He paused. Named after you. With a full program budget for supplementary books, student materials, and an annual academic distinction award for demonstrated literary achievement. Another pause. For any student in the school, regardless of where they live. She was looking at the table now, at the grain of the wood, at a particular knot in the surface that she had looked at 10,000 times in 31 years and could have drawn from memory. He was not finished. There is also, he said, a separate document from my personal financial accounts, not the foundation. A direct transaction that covers the property tax lien in full, the outstanding medical bill balance, and a trust account established in your name with a monthly distribution that matches your pension at its original unrestructured amount for the rest of your life. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October light had moved again, the maples doing what they did in the hours before noon, the gold becoming something fuller and more saturated, the kind of light that makes everything it falls on look like it belongs to a painting. Margaret Calloway sat at her kitchen table and looked at the envelope and held herself completely still for a moment in the way she was still when she was thinking with her full attention rather than reacting. And she thought about a classroom on a cold morning in September of 1990 and a boy in the third row with a battered paperback and a careful silence and the entire rest of his life waiting inside him like a thing that needed a room to become. She thought about Principal Hartwell's office. About the word final and her own response to it. About Dorothy Ames who had returned her call and made her own calls. About Isabel Reyes in the bleachers in the dress the color of the sky. She thought about the letter in the drawer, 3 handwritten pages from 1991, signed gratefully, Elias. She looked up. His eyes were not composed now. They were the eyes of the 17-year-old in the third row, the ones she had watched for an entire year, the ones that held everything he was with the controlled discipline of a person who had learned that revealing too much cost something. He had revealed it now. He was sitting across from her in her kitchen with his eyes open in the way they were open when he had read his scholarship notification and understood it was real, and he was waiting for her with the same patience he had always waited for her, with the trust that she would give him the right response. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she said the thing that she had said to him 35 years ago, in room 114, sliding the formal notification letter across her desk in the September afternoon light. She said it simply and without decoration because it was still the true thing, the most accurate sentence available to the moment. She said, Elias. I'm the one who hasn't earned this. He said, then we disagree. His voice was very quiet. And I've been waiting 35 years to have that argument with you. She looked at him across the table. And for the first time since he had walked through her door, she felt the full weight of the morning lift slightly, not disappear, but shift, redistribute, become something she was not carrying alone. Outside on Clover Street, the limousine sat at the curb with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and had learned not to be impatient about it. The maples burned their particular gold against the sky. The neighborhood that had changed around her house while she stayed held its October stillness, and inside the kitchen of the White Craftsman bungalow on Clover Street, 2 people sat across a table from each other with a cream-colored envelope between them and 35 years of accumulated weight and a disagreement that was, in every way that mattered, the beginning of something. Her phone lit up on the table again. Not Patricia this time. A number she did not recognize, a Columbus area code. She looked at Elias. He said, that would be Hannah. My chief of staff. A pause. She's calling to tell you that the school district's pension modification documentation has already been sent to our legal team in Columbus and that they have identified 3 procedural violations in the original restructuring notice. She looked at her phone. At him. At the envelope. 3, she said. She tends toward thoroughness, he said. There was something in the way he said it that was almost, under the composure and the weight of everything, something like warmth. Something like the sideways humor of a person who has been carrying a very long story and has finally arrived at the part where the carrying is shared. She answered the phone. Hannah Osei spoke with the precise, unhurried confidence of someone who had been solving complex problems for a long time and had arrived at a relationship with difficulty that was not adversarial but practical. She introduced herself, confirmed she was calling on behalf of Elias Reyes, and then described, in clear and specific language, what the Reyes Foundation's legal team had found in the pension restructuring documentation that Margaret had kept in her filing cabinet in the spare room of her house on Clover Street. The first violation was procedural. Ohio statute required that pension modification notices of this magnitude include a formal disclosure of the district's actuarial methodology, written in plain language accessible to a non-specialist reader. The letter Margaret had received contained no such disclosure. It contained a reference to actuarial adjustments without any supporting documentation. The second violation was temporal. The statute also required a minimum 45-day notice period before any modification took effect, measured from the date of certified mail receipt. The modification had taken effect 31 days after Margaret had signed for the certified letter. She had signed for it on a Monday. She remembered the Monday because it had been cold and she had stood at the door in her cardigan and her neighbor Mrs. Briggs across the street had waved and she had waved back and then brought the letter inside and set it on the counter. 14 days short. The third violation was the most significant. The district pension board had approved the restructuring in a session that had not been publicly noticed as required. The meeting had been listed in the board's internal calendar as a routine administrative review and had not appeared in the public meeting schedule that Ohio's Sunshine Law required for decisions of this nature. Which meant the decision that had reduced Margaret Calloway's monthly income by $412 had been made in a room that the public had never been invited to enter. Hannah said all of this clearly and then said that the legal team was prepared to file a formal challenge with the Ohio Department of Education's Pension Oversight Division by end of week, requesting a full review of the modification and an immediate reinstatement of the original benefit amount pending that review. She said that this was not a guaranteed outcome, that pension challenges involved their own procedural timelines, but that the strength of the procedural violations made the case for reversal substantially stronger than average, and that the team intended to pursue it with full resources. Then she asked Margaret if she had any questions. Margaret had several, and she asked them in the specific, careful way she had always asked questions when the answers mattered, and Hannah answered each one with the same unhurried precision. When they finished, Hannah said she would send a full written summary of the findings and the planned filing to an email address Margaret provided, and that someone from the team would be in touch within 24 hours. Margaret thanked her and ended the call. She set the phone on the table and sat with the information for a moment. 45 days required. 31 provided. A meeting not publicly noticed. 14 months of managing the arithmetic of a smaller income, 14 months of pharmacy timing and grocery list decisions and the property tax letter in the kitchen drawer, all of it traceable to a decision made in a room that should not have been closed. She looked at Elias. He was watching her with the same expression he had carried through the morning, the reading expression, but there was something added to it now that she recognized as relief. The relief of a person who has been concerned about something for longer than they have shown and has now heard the concern confirmed as addressable. "You already knew about the violations," she said. It was not an accusation. "Hannah flagged the documentation issues yesterday," he said. "I wanted to be here when you heard it directly from her." She nodded slowly. Outside, the October morning had moved into that particular midday quality of late autumn light in the Midwest, flatter and more honest than the morning gold, the kind of light that shows things clearly without flattering them. She looked at her kitchen in it. The clean counter, the functional appliances, the window above the sink that she had never been able to afford to replace and that let in a draft every winter that she managed with a rolled towel pressed along the sill. She looked at all of it and felt, for the first time in 14 months, that the arithmetic of her days might be about to change. She was still sitting with that feeling when she heard a knock at the front door. She looked at Elias. He looked at the door and then back at her, and his expression carried something she had not seen on it before in this morning full of new expressions. Something that was younger than the rest of him. Something almost nervous. "I may have told her it was all right to come at noon," he said. Margaret stood up and went to the front door and opened it. Isabel Reyes was 71 years old. She was a small woman, smaller than Margaret had remembered her from the graduation bleachers 35 years ago, but people often seemed smaller at a distance than they were up close, and Margaret understood as she looked at her that the small was a physical fact and nothing more, that what this woman occupied in any room she entered had never been determined by her height. Her hair was silver and white and pulled back from a face that had the particular beauty of faces that have spent decades fully in the world, that have been weathered by work and love and grief and time and have arrived at their current form through genuine living rather than careful management. She was wearing a dark coat and a scarf the color of autumn leaves, and she was holding, in both hands in front of her, an envelope. A different envelope from the one Elias had placed on the kitchen table. This one was handwritten on both sides and slightly thicker and had been, Margaret could see even from the doorway, handled many times in the way that things are handled when they are important and you keep returning to them. She had been revising it for 6 weeks. Isabel looked at Margaret and her face did the thing that faces do when a long search ends. Not collapse, not drama. The quiet, complete, full-body recognition of having arrived somewhere that mattered. She said, in a voice that was steady because she had prepared it to be steady and because she was a woman who had worked double shifts on weekends and holidays and knew how to hold herself upright when holding yourself upright was what the moment required. She said, I have been wanting to say thank you to you for 35 years, and I am afraid my letter is not sufficient and I'm going to say it wrong. Margaret said, come in, Isabel. They sat in the living room, the three of them. Isabel in the chair that was Margaret's and Margaret in the chair that had been Daniel's and Elias on the sofa between them, and something about that arrangement felt exactly right in a way that required no adjustment. Isabel gave her the letter. Margaret held it. She would read it later, alone, in the quiet of the evening when the house had settled back into itself and the day's accumulated weight had given her space to receive it fully. She understood that the letter deserved that kind of reading and she told Isabel so, and Isabel nodded with the expression of someone who has put something important into another person's hands and trusts them with it completely. Then Isabel talked. She talked about the year Elias was in room 114 and the letter of recommendation Margaret had written that Isabel had read in full, because Elias had shown her, because he wanted her to understand what was being said about him in a document signed by someone with authority to say it. She talked about the scholarship fight, which she had not known was a fight until after it was over, because Elias had not told her while it was happening, because he had not wanted her to worry. She had found out from Dorothy Ames's daughter, who had been a student at the same time and whose mother had apparently mentioned it at a church supper, and she had sat with that knowledge for 35 years and had felt it the way certain knowledge lodges itself, permanently and with gratitude too large for ordinary expression. She talked about Rodrigo, Elias's father, who had died 8 years ago of heart failure, too early, much too early, and who had known about the company's early success but had not lived to see what it became, and who had said to her in the last weeks of his life that the thing he was most proud of was not a specific achievement of his own but the fact that his son had found a teacher who saw him clearly, and that Elias had been brave enough to be seen. Margaret listened to all of this and held the envelope in her hands and felt the particular feeling that comes when you understand that a thing you did decades ago in a room that held only 2 people has been carried forward in someone else's life as something significant, the understanding that your quiet actions have a larger life than the privacy of the moment in which you took them. She thought about her mother, Evelyn, who had taught school in rural Kentucky for 22 years on a salary that required 2 other sources of income and who had nonetheless, when Margaret had come home her first year of teaching and described a student she was worried about, told her the same thing she told her. Every year. She had said, the student who worries you most is usually the one who needs you most. Stay. She had stayed. She had always stayed. She said to Isabel, he was the easiest student I ever had to believe in. He did all the work himself. I just made sure the door stayed open. Isabel looked at her steadily. That is exactly what a person who opened a door would say, she said. Elias, on the sofa between them, said nothing. But Margaret could see him and she could see that he was not trying to say anything, that he was doing what he had always done in rooms that contained something important, absorbing it completely and holding it. Patricia called again at 2 in the afternoon. Margaret answered this time on the second ring and told her daughter, in the direct and unhurried way she told her daughter everything, that a former student had come to visit and that she was going to need Sunday's video call to become a proper explanation, and that she was fine, more than fine, and that Patricia should not worry. Patricia said, in the voice she used when she was choosing her words carefully because she had her father's instinct for knowing when a situation was larger than its surface, Mom. Who is this student? Margaret said, his name is Elias Reyes. You may have read about him. A pause. The technology company. Yes. Another pause, longer. Mom. Sunday, Margaret said. I'll explain everything Sunday. Come early. Patricia came to Hargrove that Saturday. She did not wait for Sunday. She drove from Portland to Columbus and flew the rest of the way and arrived at the door of the house on Clover Street at 4 in the afternoon with a rolling suitcase and the expression of a woman who has grown up watching her mother handle things quietly and has spent her adult life alternating between admiring it and being frustrated by it. She had looked at the property tax letter in the kitchen drawer, which Margaret had not hidden but had also not shown her, and she had sat at the kitchen table with it in her hands and looked at her mother across it with an expression that was not anger but its complicated cousin. Margaret had said, "I was managing it." Patricia had said, "I know you were managing it. You've been managing everything by yourself for 7 years and you never tell me when the managing is hard." Margaret had said, "You have your own life." Patricia had said, "You are my life," and then she had stopped, and they had both sat with that for a moment, and then Patricia had picked up her coffee and they had continued, because that was what the Calloway women did, they continued. Elias and Patricia had spoken by phone on the Friday in between. Patricia had called him, not the other way around. She had found his contact through the company website and had called the main number and had said she was Margaret Calloway's daughter and needed to speak with him directly, and the professionalism with which that request was handled had resulted in him returning her call within 40 minutes. They had talked for an hour. Patricia had asked the questions her mother hadn't, the specific detailed questions of a woman who had spent 20 years in hospital administration and knew what questions to ask about financial and legal arrangements before accepting them. Elias had answered every one of them and had then said, before they finished, that he wanted her to know that what he was doing had no conditions attached. That it was not contingent on anything her mother agreed to or did not agree to. That certain debts could be repaid in full and with gratitude and still feel insufficient, but that you paid them anyway because the alternative was to carry them. Patricia had been quiet for a moment after that. Then she had said, "She told me about you." "Not recently. When I was about 12, she told me about a student she had fought for. She didn't tell me your name. She just told me the story and said it was one of the reasons she kept teaching." Elias had been quiet for a moment on his end. Patricia had said, "She'll argue about the money. She'll try to give some of it back." He had said, "I know. That's why it's already done." The legal filing happened on a Thursday. Hannah's team submitted the formal challenge to the Ohio Department of Education's Pension Oversight Division with the 3 procedural violations documented fully and a request for expedited review given the ongoing financial impact on the affected retiree. The filing was not dramatic in the way that important things are sometimes not dramatic, a document submitted through proper channels with the methodical precision of people who have done their preparation thoroughly and trust the work to speak. The response came faster than anticipated. For weeks after the filing, the Oversight Division issued a preliminary finding that the district's modification notification had failed to meet statutory requirements in 2 of the 3 cited areas. The division ordered an immediate temporary reinstatement of the original benefit amount pending full review, which meant that on the 1st of November, Margaret Calloway's pension was returned to the number it had been before the letter arrived on that January afternoon 3 years ago. She stood at the kitchen counter on the morning the confirmation letter arrived and read it twice, the way she had developed a habit of reading important letters, the first time for the overall shape of it and the second time for the specific detail. Then she set it on the counter and made herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window above the sink and looked at the side garden in the November light. The full review would take several more months. Hannah's team would remain involved through its completion. The outcome was not guaranteed, and Margaret had learned enough in 68 years not to treat preliminary findings as final ones. But the number in her bank account on the 1st of November was the correct number, and the property tax lien had been cleared, and the medical bill balance had been resolved, and the pharmacy arithmetic that she had been doing in her head for 14 months was no longer necessary. She drank her coffee in the November light and felt the particular quality of relief that comes not from an absence of difficulty but from a restoration of ground, the feeling of standing on something solid again after a long time on uncertain footing. The endowed chair announcement happened in January. The Hargrove Millbrook School District's winter board meeting was a public session, which was relevant because the Reyes Foundation's legal team had made a point of ensuring that public sessions were publicly noticed properly, and the room was, as a result, more full than winter board meetings in Hargrove typically were. Local press was there. A journalist from the Columbus Dispatch had driven down. Several former Hargrove High School teachers were in attendance, including 2 who had been there in 1991 and who sat in the third row and watched the proceedings with the particular quality of attention that people bring to things they understand the history of. The Foundation's formal proposal for the Margaret E. Calloway Endowed Chair in English Literature and Writing was presented by Hannah Osei, who stood at the front of the room in a dark blazer and laid out the full scope of the program with the same precision she brought to everything. The chair provided for a dedicated full-time teaching position with program funding for supplementary materials, a classroom library, student writing workshops, and an annual academic distinction award for demonstrated literary achievement open to any student in the district regardless of neighborhood or enrollment track. The award carried a cash scholarship component and a letter of distinction from the Reyes Foundation. The letter of distinction, Hannah noted, could accompany college applications and carried weight in certain admissions offices disproportionate to the dollar amount attached. She did not elaborate on why that specific detail had been included. The board voted unanimously to accept. There was no procedural discussion. The vote lasted 4 minutes. In the second row, Margaret Calloway sat between Patricia and Elias and did not say anything during the proceedings because it had not been her room to speak in, but when the vote was recorded and the board chair said her name and the room turned toward her, she stood up, because standing was what the moment required. She thanked the board in 3 sentences. She thanked the Reyes Foundation in 2. She said that the award was not named correctly, that it should have been named after the students it was designed to serve, and that she intended to say so every time anyone asked her about it, which produced a sound from the room that was somewhere between laughter and agreement. Then she sat down. Patricia's hand was on her arm. Elias was looking at the front of the room, and his expression was the one that she had filed away permanently on an afternoon in room 114 when she had slid a scholarship letter across her desk and said, "You earned this," and he had looked at her with the controlled stillness of someone understanding that something real had just happened. He was using the same expression now, slightly worn around the edges by 35 additional years, and more complete. The complete expression of a person who has done a thing that needed to be done and has done it as well as it could be done and has arrived at the other side of it and found it sufficient. Gerald Hartwell had attended. She had not known he would be there. He was in the back row, heavier than she remembered, slower in his movements, but recognizable, the broad confident posture slightly diminished but present. He had seen her when she came in and she had seen him see her, and there had been a brief moment between them of the kind that exists between 2 people who have a long shared history that includes a specific point of disagreement they both remember precisely. She had nodded to him. One nod. Brief, even, without warmth and without hostility. The nod of a person who is done carrying something and is demonstrating the fact by putting it down publicly and walking on. He had not approached her after the meeting. She had not expected him to. What she thought about, on the drive back to Clover Street with Patricia and Elias in the car and the January dark coming down outside the windows, was not Hartwell. She thought about Dorothy Ames, who had returned a phone call 35 years ago and made her own calls, and who had died 4 years after the scholarship was awarded, and who had never known the full shape of what that phone call had helped produce. She thought about the 9 names on Hartwell's speech at the alumni dinner, about what it means to be the kind of person whose contribution fits into a speech versus the kind whose contribution does not, and she thought that on balance she would have the latter. She thought about the new award. About the first student who would receive it, whoever they were, wherever they lived in Hargrove, whatever row they sat in. About the letter of distinction that would accompany their applications, the weight of it in certain admissions offices, the door it would help hold open. She thought about the version of that student in which the door was not held open, and she put that version away where she had always put the things she could not change, not forgotten but filed, not carried forward. Spring came to Hargrove the way spring comes to Ohio, slowly and with some ambivalence, the cold retreating by degrees rather than all at once, the ground taking its time to decide. Margaret had always loved the specific quality of March in the Midwest, the uncertainty of it, the sense that the world was making up its mind and could still go either way. She had spent 30 years telling students that uncertainty was not the enemy of good thinking but its condition, that the ability to stay clear-headed in the middle of an unresolved question was one of the most important skills a person could develop. The garden had new plantings in March. Elias had sent someone, a woman from a landscape company in Columbus, who had come in February and walked the side garden with Margaret for 40 minutes and listened to her describe what it had been and what she wanted it to become. Margaret had described Daniel's plantings, the hostas along the north edge, the climbing rows he had trained over 3 seasons along the back fence, the kitchen herb section near the house that she had always maintained with more success than the ornamental beds because the herbs were useful and she found it easier to tend the things that were useful. The landscape woman had listened and taken notes and returned the following week with a proposal that was thoughtful and specific and honored the history of the space without being a simple recreation of it. The new garden was not Daniel's garden. It was something that grew from Daniel's garden, which seemed to Margaret exactly correct, the right relationship between what had been and what could be. She planted the herbs herself, on a Saturday morning in late March when the ground was finally cooperative and the air had the first genuine warmth of the season in it. She knelt on the garden pad Patricia had sent her, the good one with the thick foam cushioning that protected her hip, and pressed the rosemary and the thyme and the flat-leaf parsley into the soil with her hands, the way she had done it for 20 years when Daniel was alive and the garden was his and she was simply visiting it. It felt different now. It felt like hers. She sat back on her heels when the planting was done and looked at the garden in the March light and felt the particular feeling that comes when you have finished doing something that needed to be done, not the completion of a task but the completion of a restoration, the feeling of something returned to a state of possibility after a period of being otherwise. Patricia called as she was washing her hands at the kitchen sink. "How's the garden?" she asked. She asked about the garden the way she had started asking about things that mattered to her mother, specifically, by name, as if she had decided that caring about the details was the most accurate form of caring available. "Good," Margaret said. "The rosemary's in. Dad would have opinions about the placement." "He would have been wrong about the placement," Margaret said. "The rosemary needs the south-facing bed. He always wanted it on the north side and it never did well there." Patricia laughed. It was the laugh she had inherited from her father, sudden and full and completely unguarded. Margaret dried her hands and stood at the window above the sink and listened to it. She thought about Elias's son, 9 years old and named Daniel, who would grow up in a world shaped in small and permanent ways by a decision made in a room on a cold morning in February of 1991 when his father's teacher had looked at a principal and said that nothing was final until the award had been given. She thought about Clara, 12 years old, with her father's relationship with computers and her mother's relationship with argument, who would grow up knowing that the endowed chair at a high school in a small Ohio town bore a name that meant something specific in the history of her family. She thought about the first student who would sit in room 114 under the Margaret Calloway chair program, whoever they were, wherever they sat, whatever they were carrying into that room with them that they had not yet been given the language or the space to put down. She thought about her mother Evelyn in Kentucky, teaching school for 22 years on a salary that required 2 other sources of income, telling her daughter at the kitchen table that the student who worries you most is usually the one who needs you most. She thought about a boy in the 3rd row with a battered paperback and the whole rest of his life waiting inside him like a thing that needed a room to become. What she had given him, in the end, was not the scholarship. The scholarship was a mechanism. What she had given him was what every great teacher gives every student they truly see, the evidence that someone with authority and knowledge and the standing to say so believed, without qualification and without condition, that what was inside them was real and worth the space it would require. That was not a transaction. It was not a gift in the ordinary sense. It was more like a truth told at the exact moment a person needed to hear it and was able to receive it. And truths told at the right moment do not expire. They travel forward in the people who carry them, across decades and through difficulty, past every obstacle that insufficient people place in the way, into the rooms where the important decisions are made, and from those rooms out into the world in forms too numerous and too specific to track. She did not think of herself as the source of what Elias had built. She was clear about that in the way she was clear about most important things. She was one person who had been in the right room at the right time and had done what was correct, and the doing of it had cost her something, and she had paid that cost without ceremony because the alternative was not something she could live inside. She understood now, with the full understanding that only time and consequence can produce, that the cost had been returned to her. Not in the way she would have designed it, not on any schedule she had imagined, not in the form she would have anticipated. But returned, fully and with interest, in the form of the cream-colored envelope on the kitchen table, in the property tax letter that was no longer in the drawer, in the pension number that was the correct number again, in the endowed chair with the wrong name on it, in the garden with the rosemary in the right bed, in the 9-year-old boy in Columbus named Daniel. She stood at the window above the sink in the March light and looked at the garden and thought that this was what it meant when people said that kindness returns. Not that the universe keeps a ledger. Not that every good act is rewarded in proportion. Not that goodness is a strategy. But that the things you do from your truest self, the things you do because they are correct and because you cannot do otherwise and remain who you are, those things travel further than you can see from where you are standing when you do them. And sometimes, across enough time and enough distance, they find their way back. She had not helped Elias Reyes because she expected to be found 35 years later. She had helped him because he was in front of her and he was real and he had earned what was being kept from him, and she was the person in the room with the standing to say so. She would make the same choice tomorrow. She had made it every day for 40 years. She would go on making it in the time she had remaining, not because she was waiting for a limousine or an envelope or a letter from a pension oversight division, but because it was simply who she was, the thing at the center of her that had been there before the teaching began and would be there after. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the right way to use what they were given. Margaret Calloway had known from the beginning. She had stood in front of young people and opened rooms for them. She had fought for them in the rooms they were not invited to enter. She had put books on their desks and questions on the board and waited with full attention while they arrived at answers that surprised everyone except her. She had stayed. She had always stayed. And on a Tuesday morning in October, the world had driven down Clover Street in a black limousine and knocked on her door and said, in the voice of the boy who used to arrive 12 minutes before the first bell, "Mrs. C. I've been looking for you." She had opened the door. That was all. That had always been all. And it had been, from the very beginning, exactly enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.